peers. So many of you are such good writers. I hope that I can provide some guidance for you. I think that there are a lot of basics in writing that we need to keep returning to and returning to and returning to, because we forget. We get off on these wonderful stories, but we need to keep coming back to the basics that make our stories interesting. Can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
Okay, I'm using my outdoor recess time teacher voice because we don't have a mic. So if it turns out that I start to get quieter, wave at me and let me know. Okay, I won't be insulted at all. So today we're going to talk about using sensory details in our writing. And we have often heard this said. We've all heard this a million times. Don't tell, show, or show, not tell. What does that mean? Well, if you ask Judy Reeves, who wrote A Writer's Book of Days, this is what she said. Don't settle for red when crimson is what you want. If not crimson, what about carmine, scarlet, garnet? You get the idea. But we hear that all the time. But what does it really mean? Does it mean we throw a whole bunch of adjectives in there? We have this whole long list of adjectives? No. What it means is we pick very specific words and very specific nouns, adjectives, verbs, so that we are showing exactly what we mean. Anne Lamott says all you have to do is describe this much. You don't have to be faced with describing that much. Just describe this much, and then this much, and then this much. The size of a postcard, she says. But what is and Anton Chekhov, this is one of my favorite quotes about using details in this way. He says, don't tell me the moon is shining, show me the glint of light on broken glass. So you can visualize that, right? You can imagine a very dark night and the moon suddenly comes from behind a cloud or a tree or a mountaintop, and all of a sudden the ground lights up like giant glitter because there's broken glass there. So just saying there was a large full moon and everything I could see just fine even in the night, that's pretty boring and that's very telling. But showing that glinting glass is what we're looking for. So in my thinking, it's not even show, not tell. It's not just show. Because if you're showing someone, there's still a distance between the reader and the writer. What we want to do is transport the reader into the place. Put them right in the middle of the characters, right in the middle of the action. Make them so lost in your writing that they don't for a moment know where they are when the phone rings. Right? We've all been there. We're reading along and suddenly someone taps us on the shoulder. We startle and they've been calling our name for 3 minutes and we haven't heard a thing because we were transported. Stephen King, in his book on writing, which I think, by the way, is probably the best book I've ever read about writing. I see I have a couple of nodding heads and applause. He says that reading and writing is like magic. That we are basically mind melding with an author who's far away in both time and space. And yet our brain and their brain are communicating on an intimate level. right? You can read Jane Austen, who's been dead for a really long time, and yet her world that she created comes alive when you read, and you are transported into it. So what we want to do is be able to provide the reader with like a door into a world. How do we do that? Scientists will tell you that that little amygdala on the left side of your brain, pretty deep inside, about the size of an almond, is how we do it. The amygdala, and here's the kind of the definition of its function. I pulled this right, out of the dictionary. It has been shown to perform a primary role in the processing of memory, decision-making, and emotional responses. It jumps in before our intellect jumps in when we experience something. There's a direct line from our senses to the amygdala that is lightning fast, whereas it's slightly slower going to our decision-making frontal cortex. That's why, in the story that always goes with this, if you're walking down a trail and there's a stick up ahead and it kind of looks like a snake, you will flip out about the snake before your brain has time to process that it's only a stick. That amygdala is how we connect emotions with someone else, right? You watch a movie, you cry. You cry as if the sadness or the happiness is happening to you because your amygdala is enhanced, triggered, going off. That's how we communicate with our readers in writing. So the amygdala is what's making the connection between memories of our previous experiences and current sensory experiences. They have done studies where they map the brain and they show people emotional pictures or have them read emotional stories or watch an emotional video, and the reaction inside of the brain is identical to if that thing happened to the person. The brain, the amygdala, knows no difference between reality and fantasy. So when you read a book and it triggers an emotion through memories of yours, you are there. You have been transported. So our job as writers is to trigger that amygdala. And we do that. It doesn't have to be strong, powerful, emotion-generating stuff. It doesn't have to be like make the person cry. It just has to trigger familiar memories. And then the story becomes intimate and personal to the reader. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is how we do that. So I'm going to read this to you. I really don't like it when people read off the screen, but what I want you to do is close your eyes. And as I read this, I want you to let your amygdala feel this too. You could smell ripe strawberries before you saw them. The fragrance mingling with the smell of sun on damp ground. It was the smell of June, the last day of school when we were set free. I lie on my stomach in my favorite patches, watching the berries grow sweeter and bigger under the leaves. Each tiny wild berry was scarcely bigger than a raindrop, dimpled with seeds under the cap of leaves. From that vantage point, I could pick only the reddest of the red. leaving the pink ones for tomorrow. You can open your eyes. You probably generated the smell of strawberries. Not ones that have been sitting in the refrigerator at Rayleigh's or your own refrigerator, but warm ones that you picked up from the stand at the side of the road. You probably smelled it, or picked in your own garden. That was from Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which is a book that is full of transporting descriptions. She's brought in what? Visual. We get all the red and the sizes and the textures. We know she's touching them. So we've got some touch texture there too. The smell of the earth and the strawberries, the warmth on her skin, all of those things. We don't have any sound in there, but other than that, it's all there. She's not actually tasting them there, but she's thinking about tasting them, and we're thinking about tasting them. So that's a really good example of being transported by words that generate memories, previous knowledge through your amygdala. So we're going to play a little bit right now. In front of you, in that little tray, are some lemons, which you can touch or smell or whatever. And there's also lemon candies, individually wrapped so they're nice and safe. I would ask you, if you're so inclined, to take one of the candies and put it in your mouth. I've just given it, like the hook. Put one of the candies in your mouth. If you can't, there's sugar, so if you can't have sugar, then that's okay. You'll have to deal with the lemon itself. But taste them. Feel the sour. Take a minute to imagine all the things that remind you of, all the things that brings up into your mind. Okay? Single word, adjectives, nouns, verbs even, phrases, idioms, metaphors, memories of specific times. And then I'm going to ask you to spend about 3 minutes to make a list. Just a list of anything and everything having to do with lemon and sour that comes to mind. So I'm going to start my timer right now. Don't think, just write. Emote, write on the paper. You could start with yellow if you can't think of anything else. How many of you got lemonade on that list? Did your creative brain go to the car that was a lemon? How about someone with a sour disposition? Okay. Stop. And now go back and audition your list, read through it, and find. Audition your list, which means to go back and read through it and find 2 things you're particularly tickled by. Something that just, that was cool, I wrote that down. That was so clever of me. And underline them or circle them. And then turn to a neighbor and share one or both. And listen as your neighbor shares one or both. Okay, let's come back. I should have my bell. Ding, 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 ding. There, They're just like 8th graders. They don't stop talking. Can I have your attention back, ladies and gentlemen? Thank you. Feel free to steal the ideas. If something came up that you just really liked, jot it down. That's fair. All's fair in love and writing. So, I love this little phrase. My taste buds recoiled from the sudden tartness, drawing my lips into a pucker. Did anybody write pucker? Very good. Very good. Okay. We did the list. We did the share. Truth. That's what we're trying to capture when we write, right? Whether it's a made-up fantasy world that we're creating, or a real-life memoir, or a realistic historical fiction, what we're trying to do is capture truth. Because if it isn't truth, then readers won't like it. They won't read it. They won't be taken in by it. Nobody can be transported into an incomplete world and feel satisfied. Whether it's the real world of the 1950s in the San Fernando Valley, or if it's the imaginary world of, 2100 in, whatever's going on then. It has to be a complete and real world, and in order to do that, we have to do the details. If there are no details, or there are missing significant details, then it's like taking a walk in the woods and there's no sound. There's no birds, there's no woodpeckers pecking, there's no wind in the trees, there's none of those things. That's an incomplete world. It is not truth. Let's see. So in order to transport our readers, we have to create complete worlds. Because then they can get familiar with it, they recognize it. Even if you made it up, it still makes sense. And if you don't do that, then the people and the actions are sort of hanging in space. They're not grounded anywhere. And so it's really hard to identify with, fall in love with, empathize with a character in an unreal world. Okay, we're going to move to sound. We did taste, let's move to sound. The stream flowed past. What I want you to do now is close your eyes again, and I want you to imagine a stream or a river that you are familiar with. Maybe it's a favorite place, maybe it's on the back of your property, maybe it's some special place that you go. Imagine it. Visualize it. Listen to it. Touch it, if you will. Smell the air around it. Could taste it, I suppose. Think about that. Visualize it. Note how the sounds are dynamic. They're not constant. They change. Do they change as the visuals change? As the water flows and it moves in the light, does the light change? Does the sound change? Okay, open your eyes and let's take 5 minutes to write that description. You can put yourself on the shoreline and describe it from a standing position. You can approach it from a distance and have the details come on and be revealed 1 or 2 at a time. You can be sitting there soaking your feet in it, whatever you like. But transport us to the river with you. Put us there with you. 5 minutes. Okay. Finish that sentence. Set your pens and pencils down. Now go back and audition your writing. Read it to yourself once through, and on the way through, take your pen or pencil and underline or circle the best little part, like 3 sentences max,
Okay.
all together. What do you like? What's the best part? Something that's transporting. What'd you say?
Who's got 3 sentences?
If you don't, that's okay. Circle the one best one, right? I just gave the max. Something you might want to share with a neighbor because you think it's pretty cool. Share with a neighbor or your table what you chose. Listen carefully and listen for the sounds and the visuals and all of the other sensory detail. Go. Okay. I would like to hear a few of those things. I'm going to share one I wrote, and then I'm going to ask one person per table to share. So this comes from the book that I've got all my fingers crossed about. What? Watching flowing water is like listening to a symphony orchestra. If you attend closely, you can pick out the contribution of each note, each instrument, each drop of water, each ripple. Simultaneously, you can enjoy the beauty of the whole composition, the entire river. I'd have been content to sit in the shade beside the Lyell for hours, mesmerized by the dynamic colors and patterns of its motion. Deep blues, near violet, transparent aquas and greens, swirling lines and starbursts of reflected silver and gold. Wow. Comparing vision to sound. Okay, let me hear something. Yeah, I'd love to hear yours, nice and loudly.
Okay. Dusty hot banks frame the racetrack of the icy stream. The deafening roar of swiftly flowing water noisily crashing into boulders, leaving foaming clouds in its wake.
Nice.
I was taken immediately by the racetrack.
Yeah.
Immediately, I got the idea of really rushing water. It's not meandering, it's not lollygagging, it is a racetrack. It immediately got my attention. Lovely. Yeah.
Okay. We were young and unaware of the danger. To us, it meant excitement and the amazing sensation of free falling, floating, twisting, and the cold, vibrating wet of the rapids. We jumped into the frothing current and gave ourselves to the control of the rapids.
Ooh, frothing and vibrating and giving yourself over. Lovely. Right? That is that foolish child idea, but we all do that. Yeah. Yeah.
Sure.
Philip,
The river rushes over the large white
can you turn and face the crowd while you read? Because I'm afraid they're not hearing you.
The river rushes over the large white granite boulders. It falls over the edges, crashing to the pool below in whirls and bubbles. From the pools, the river meanders the slow ravine, rippling over small rocks. Fish that dart from the shadows to a tasty treat in the sun and back again to the moss-covered pebbles covering the bottom.
Such a contrast between the crashing of the falling water and the gentleness of the meandering. And you show how gentle because you've got fish just lollygagging around. Nice. Yes.
The stream trickled over the rocks. Nothing raging, nothing wimpy. Just trinkling, as if it were a glass wind chime clinking in the breeze.
Ooh, trinkling is a made-up word, and it's wonderful. Right? It conveys kind of twinkling and kind of ringing. I like that. And comparing it to something completely different, we get immediately that high-pitched ringing sound. Nice. Dora?
The stream,
Face those guys.
the stream churned, striking, smoothing the edges of the flat stones, rising as it encountered a weathered log, disassembling it bit by bit, smoothing the top, flowing over to the outer edge, meeting up with the macerated leaves and debris as it found its way downstream.
A lot of personification in that. It's alive, it's a living thing, and it's interacting with purpose, with rocks and logs and finding its way. Personification is a powerful way to make the world come alive around us. Anybody else? Those are tough acts to follow. I can understand why everyone's going, but those were really wonderful. You took us there. You transported us to those places. And if you put a character in there, right, then your reader is going to be there with that person as either third person or first person. You understand what they're encountering. Dorothy Allison, I don't even know who the woman is, but I like the statement because I think this is really true. In our writing, we forget that other people are not as familiar with what we're talking about as we are. And so we forget to tell them the details because to us saying, the front door is so clear. We know it's made of oak and it has a little, sunburst window in the top and blah, blah, blah. They don't know that. So they're going to visualize something completely different or nothing at all. And if that front door is important because someone's going to knock on it or open it or run through it or slam it, then the reader needs to see it, right? So she says, place is often something you don't see because you're so familiar with it. But in fact, it is the information your reader most wants to know. Because if you have to put your reader there. All right. So we're going to take a look at smell now. We're adding these things to the pile. Make small things big and wrap a scene around them. So what's a scene? A scene is the action, the interaction, the goings on, the detailed happenings.
Words being spoken. Words being spoken.
Words being spoken, right, interactions. It's all of when your characters come together with other characters or objects or the environment and they're doing something and we want to show it in detail. There are small things in that setting that will transport your reader there so they can be in the middle of what's going on. So here's something that's one short sentence, but tell me this doesn't take you back to your elementary school classroom. My warm classroom, with its 4 tidy rows of 5 desks each, smelled of peanut butter, ripe bananas, and cedar pencil shavings. Lists are a wonderful way to provide a lot of details really quickly. And what's fun is when you make lists that have to do with senses, like this one. But if you ask, sort of like that Sesame Street thing, which one of these does not belong, and I showed you peanut butter, ripe bananas, and pencils, you'd go, the pencils don't belong, but in this, it's obvious. They do belong. And those funny little, it doesn't quite follow, and then it's kind of a surprise. The pencil shavings is kind of a surprise here, but it completes the picture for us. Here's another example. This comes from Pariah's Lament by Richie Billing. Laughter rippled from the table behind Edvar. The three men were tanners, the least difficult of all working men to identify. Stained clothes and hands, and stinking of a peculiar cocktail of rotten flesh and mint. They rubbed themselves with the latter to mask the stench of the former. Nobody could bear their presence long enough to tell them it didn't work. Did you go there? I was in this old wooden inn by the side of some ancient road, right, in some village. I was there. Were you?
Yeah.
So what was it that took you there? It was the absolute specifics, the details, and the list. The list, stained clothes and hands and stink. It's a weird list, but it really conveys. So lists are wonderful tools. Okay, now we're going to dump. We didn't do anything with visual because visual's always there. We live in a visual society. Unless you're describing a blind person, it's never not going to be there. So we've dumped them all in now, and you have in front of you on that little tray a box of Crayola crayons. Take one or two out, please, each of you. Any color will do. Feel them. They have a peculiar feel to them, or not maybe peculiar, a singular feel to them. Recognizable, memory evoking. Smell them. They have a singular aroma. Put them in your hand and, draw something on your page. Curlicues, hearts, a flower in a pot, smiley face, it doesn't matter. Just get the motion going in your hand. We're trying to trigger your amygdala because it works the other way around too. Just as you can evoke your reader's amygdala to put them there, you can trigger your own amygdala to put you there as a writer. If you're trying to think of something to write about, you're trying to create a world. So it can be a tool as a writer to bring up ideas. I recently read Kim Stanley Robinson's latest book. He, of course, is a brilliant sci-fi author, and his book, Ministry for the Future, which is relatively new, is set in the very near future, and I highly recommend it. But the one I'm talking about is his brand new memoir that just came out in the last couple of weeks called High Sierra, a love story. It's his memoir about his obsession from the time of a teenager until now, he's our age, with the Sierras. And all of the time he spent up here camping and hiking and playing and rafting in the Sierras. And he tells in one of the chapters that many of his other worlds that he has created in those sci-fi books came from the Sierras. The granite rock, the snow, the ice, the flowing, flooding rivers, the sheer cliffs, the deep forests, even the Native American grinding stones. All of those things he used to create worlds. So he accessed his own memories, his own amygdala, brought up the emotions, and he created real feeling worlds on different planets in different centuries. Yes.
What was his name again?
Kim Stanley Robinson. He's a local. He lives right here in Davis. Let's see. So we're going to do something similar here. I want you to conjure either a memory that you're going to write about for a few minutes. Actually, no, I'm lying to you. We're not going to write, because I have another writing thing I want. I want you, though, to right now still conjure something to do with the crayons. It could be a memoir-like thought, kindergarten, first grade, blah, blah, blah. It could be a rainy day at home, or it can be another character. Where might you find in science fiction crayons? Maybe people who have been sent to live on Mars, and everybody gets to bring one personal item. What might that 6-year-old bring? Because it has to be small. Maybe that. So think about that and conjure a world for a minute. Can you picture how you would have the crayons involved? Would it be a very artistic child who's making miraculous pictures for their age? Would it be an 80-year-old suffering from Alzheimer's but finds great joy every day in drawing the same pictures over and over again? Think of all the possibilities that you could create real scenes and settings just with your knowledge of crayons. And the color names of crayons are fabulous, right? Okay. I want to save time for our last writing thing, so we'll move to that. Anais, is that how you say it? Anais Nin says, we write to taste life twice, in the moment and in retrospect. And that doesn't even matter if we're writing poetry, we're writing memoir, we're creating new worlds, we're still living again each time we tell a story. It's like that line, we only live once. No, that's not true. We live every day. We only die once. So as writers, we have the advantage of living many lives. Okay, I want to share this with you. This is putting all of the senses together. The bright sun heated the ground. In fact, listen for the difference. See if you can find each of the senses in here. The bright sun heated the ground and the air around us, pulling perfume from the flowers and filling my nose with scent. Molecules of moist air brushed the velvet against my skin. Butterflies, some small and pale yellow, others black violet sprinkled with spots of gold and sapphire, fluttered and paused and moved gently from bloom to bloom. Fuzzy black bees and their smaller yellow and black striped cousins hummed and vibrated about their work, hind legs packed with golden pollen. Intent in their purposes, the flora and the fauna alike ignored the humans moving past like just another puff of breeze. So that's putting all of them together. You can only imagine what the nectar tastes like. But other than that, I think they're all there. So it is the detail and that brings the whole thing alive and makes it miraculous. Honor the miraculousness of the ordinary. I find it interesting. If you are a painter or a sculptor or a photographer, you're focusing really only on the visual. You might use texture too, but it's the visual version of texture because people aren't going to come and rub their fingers on your painting. If you're a musician or a composer, you're focused on one sense, hearing. And ditto with a cook or a chef. You're focusing maybe on two, smell and taste. But writers, storytellers, movie makers, we get to use the whole palette. We get to use the smell and the taste and the sound and the visual and the texture, the touch. So it's both an awesome palette to use, but it's also difficult because we have to pull them all in. So, when someone shows you something like this painting, there's still a distance between you and that world. That's showing, right? You sit in the museum or walk through the museum and you see this gorgeous painting and ooh and awe and wish you were in it, but you're not. You're still at a distance, even though it's beautiful and it's showing you really well. Writers take you closer. They transport you into it, and you sit in the chair and you smell the baked goods and you hear the gurgle of things being poured and the chatter going on around you. And this is what we're going to write now. I want you to think of your favorite cafe or bakery. You know, like me, you might immediately go to the baker and the cake maker down the street. Or maybe you're a flower garden person, or maybe you're a die-hard Starbucks person, or maybe you have a favorite little place that you love to go when you want to treat yourself. Maybe it's indoors, maybe it's out. When you describe it, maybe you enter the door to the ding-ding of the bell on the door, and then you're swept into the sounds and the smells of the space as you move towards the counter and look behind the glass. Or maybe you're sitting outside, you already have done that, you already have your stuff, and you were sitting there savoring that croissant and that cup of coffee. Maybe it's a Cafe Americana. And there's the sounds of people around you, and you can eavesdrop. And maybe there's a breeze. Or maybe you're in the sun and it's a little too warm. But put yourself there, and thereby put your reader there. And think about how you'll pull the reader into that space. All right, so let's take 1 minute to jot down as fast as you can all the thoughts that flood your brain, and then we'll take 5 minutes to write. Okay. Finish that sentence, put your pens and pencils down. Go back, read through, audition your writing by reading through it yourself and finding something you can share. A sentence or two that you'd like to share with your neighbor. Something that evokes some sensory detail that puts us there. So, I'd love to hear some of them, but it might be fun to read your neighbors instead of your own. But you decide. Let's see if we can get 1 or 2 from each side of the room. Who would like to share a few sentences? Yes, please, nice and loudly.
Okay, I'm reading my own.
That's okay.
Okay, should I read the whole thing? Just a couple sentences.
Just a few sentences, so we have time to share more.
Okay. Tourists in tan or white Bermuda shorts and colorful tops meander among the outdoor cafe tables and chairs or sit at them. The air is filled with their laughter, murmurs, squabbling.
That list, laughter, murmurs, and squabbling, is priceless, but so is what they're wearing. I like that. You can, and they're meandering among the tables, which is kind of interesting too. That implies sort of an aimlessness. Somebody else?
Okay.
Yes.
A perfect way to start the day is to sit outdoors in my garden. There are lots of bees, bluebirds, and hummingbirds, all flitting from one place to another. There's a great variety of color. Each rose bush competes with the other in terms of sending velvety petals to the ground and emitting perfume into the air. I enjoy fresh, juicy blackberries for my breakfast.
The rose bushes competing is wonderful. It's personifying them and turning them into minor characters in that little play. Thank you. You had your hand up too. You want to go?
Oh, yeah, I didn't know, okay. Paris, an incredible place to a visiting American. Small tables outside a small cafe, an umbrella overhead. Colors everywhere. Pink cafe walls, blue awnings, red umbrellas. People strolling by, speaking French I only half understand. The smell of French bread wafting in the air. Everywhere, loaves are present, on the tables, in handheld baskets, tote bags, and in paper bags. People at tables eating bread, tasting its sweet, sour, soft, crispy goodness.
Very nice. That idea of bread being everywhere. It's almost like, well, it is. It's like a character. You've taken the bread and putting it in all these different places. That's a nice contrast. Yes, Rebecca.
My favorite coffee shop has no ambiance, inside or outside. Just generic counters, chairs, tables. But the lack of stimulation is what I need when I have to get something done. No distractions, no interruptions, my cell phone off, or at least silent. The only excitement is the anticipation of my favorite vegan power bar and deciding what beverage to go with it today. The first bite feels like what I think an addict experiences when they get their fix. Wait, I am an addict. Then comes the perfect pairing. Today, a Tai Chi. Oh no, chai tea. The girl laughs every time I make that stupid joke. The chocolate from the power bar merges on my taste buds with the chai latte, and the cinnamon scent sets off a sparkler in my mouth.
So that beginning of it being everything that a bakery normally isn't was really a nice way, painting that stark, almost featureless, and then adding in the sensory detail in the end, which is then a real nice contrast to that. Right? After
We
Frank.
set out before breakfast. The shop was down at the end of the street through the chilly early morning, but suffused in that winter air was the smell of yeast and baking bread. Huddled in scarves and coats, people converged on the deep blue door. Stepping inside, you were engulfed, embraced with warmth and moist flavor, rye, wheat, pumpernickel. It was like stepping into a benign oven. The shelves were packed, stacked, with sleek rolls, crusted loaves, and generous buns. What to choose?
It was the verbs, the really specific verbs that caught my attention. Something about the door and then embracing and engulfing or something, and there were several really nice very specific verbs in there. I was trying to remember them all, but then you did another one and I lost the first. But that's what caught my ear in that, the specific verbs. And sometimes we forget that verbs can be terribly specific too. We worry about the adjectives or the nouns, but we forget to really look at our verbs and go for specificity there too. Go ahead, Linda.
At the flower garden, I ordered the cinnamon croissant and the small coffee. The croissant's flaky, buttery richness is dusted with sienna brown particles of fragrant spice. With light fingers, I peel off layers of fluffy dough and dip them, each sweet morsel, into the bitter black coffee.
Ooh, the peeling and the dipping. Okay, yes. There you go. More those verbs. Did you have your hand up too?
I don't know, I'll read it, but
Good.
it's not the way, I don't think it's what you wanted. She entered the orange-chipped cobblestone plaza, filled with tight-jawed people, speaking in hushed voices while sitting at wooden tables covered with flower tablecloths. The smell of gunfire overwhelmed the smell of baked bread and strong coffee.
Ooh. Okay, so tight-jawed and something else at the beginning really caught my ear. Like, that is not a happy crowd.
No.
And then the ending. Really makes me wonder, but it brought me right there. Great use of sensory detail. Okay, so kind of to wrap up, I think show not tell is not enough. I think that's old hat. And that if we really look at what really good writers do and trying to emulate them, what they do is transport us. They don't just show us something, they grab us and put us in the midst of things. Thoughts for the future, things that you can practice. We forget that because we're writing on a project and we're very project oriented, one of the best ways to get our creative juices going and expand our repertoire as writers is to just do some writing prompts. And you can use these, I call them forever prompts, because you could be a writer of, you're working on your 7th book, or you could be writing your first thing right now and be a real beginner, doing the I remember, this, that, and the other. That activates our amygdalas and brings in emotion and details. So those are forever prompts. Something to play with is something called synesthesia, where you describe one sense with the words of another, not unlike what the flowing water thing I shared with you, where I was sharing the visuals of the river with the sounds of a symphony. But you can even be more detailed, where you can say the sound was bright. You're using a visual term to describe a sound, but you know what I mean. So you can play with those kinds of things. You can take yourself on a field trip, a writer's field trip. Take you and your notebook and go somewhere. For 10 minutes, for an hour, walk among people, sit down somewhere, any number of places. Take that book and just observe really closely how people are dressed, how they move, what they sound like, what the birds sound like, all of the details, and jot some notes. Make sure you're doing the 5 senses. All of those things will perk up your writing. We get stale, especially if we're really focused on one project. And that's really what I have for you. There's a little flyer that I put out inviting you to join me for my monthly Calliope workshops on Zoom. and I put my cards out there, and now I'm ready for any questions or suggestions or ideas that I can address. Yes?
So one of the concerns that authors get is when they turn in writing, they get criticized for slowing down the plot by having too much description. What's your advice for keeping the plot moving but doing this transporting?
Editing. Right? I mean, you have to put it all in. But you need to edit it, revise it, edit it before you give it to a professional and say, I'm done. You have to go back and strip it of all the things that are unnecessary. Maybe you used to list 3 adjectives. Choose one. One really good one. Get rid of your adverbs. You have to have your characters moving through the setting, right? You're creating this world and transporting someone there, but the focus is not really on the setting. The focus is really on the action that's taking place within the setting. So, yeah, put it all in there. I like this quote. Only those who will risk going too far can possibly find out how far one can go. In other words, put it all in, and then all the good ideas that you have, and then strip it out and take it down to the best, the nugget. I guess that's my only, my tendency is verbosity, and so that is exactly my struggle. Right.
If I may, I think for me, the idea of transporting is at its best if we can to allude to something quite different, which makes the word we've actually chosen that much more eloquent or more resonant in a possibly different way.
Clarify, because I'm not sure I know what you mean.
There was a sentence, and I remember this from when I was in the service, which was a long time ago. It was in a book called A Death in the Family by James Agee.
A Death in the Family by James Agee.
Yeah. And as I best remember, it's been a long time, the narrator is going to a funeral, and he's describing people arriving at the funeral. And it was said at a time when people were still using carriages and wagons and stuff. And he describes the sunlight twittering through the spokes of the wheel.
So a word that is not used to describe a visual is taken from sound, twitter, right?
Yeah.
And yet, there it is, perfectly understandable in its use.
But it's more. Twittering, in that sense, referred to birds, referred to the sprightliness of birds, I think. At least I interpreted it that way.
Yeah, it's like a high-pitched, bright thing.
Yeah, and the idea of the different wheel spokes turning and letting the light through was just a beautiful. But again, it did more than just describe the sunlight.
Right, way more than flashing or flickering. Yeah, and it's stolen from another sense.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's that synesthesia. Yeah, Linda.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are on using this for nonfiction, and maybe specifically what I was wanting to work on is an op-ed on a topic where, you know, you're looking at opinion and facts, but how can you weave in some of these? I mean, how much, I guess is part of my question, how much can a I weave in sensory details without losing the kind of the genre, I guess, of
You know, it's interesting, I think, that nonfiction is currently evolving rapidly. You know, it used to be when you read a biography or you read a book about beavers, it was dry and boring and fact-filled, etc. And now I find authors of nonfiction are using lots and lots of literary devices that have been honed by authors of fiction. I think it started with memoir, where memoir kind of, you're telling a story, so you're using all those storytelling techniques, even though you're, you know, staying true. And I think that is spreading, it's contagious, and it's being used. I mean, I'm thinking of books like Finding the Mother Tree, or the book Beaver, or, you know, that they're very beautifully written, they're very literary, and yet fact-filled and adhering to truth. So how you do that in a short piece, like an op-ed, I think requires even more fine-tuning, but it seems to be the trend. It's making nonfiction much more accessible and much more popular.
Much more engaging.
So I can't give you specific advice about what you're writing about, but I wouldn't hesitate to do it. Especially, I mean, if you're doing the typical, you know, 5-paragraph essay, in the part where you're doing the exposition in the middle, I wouldn't hesitate to be very descriptive.
define the exposition in the middle.
The typical 5-paragraph essay, you know, is the introduction and the thesis, and then the 3 paragraphs or portions where you're giving your supporting details and exposing, or the exposition of each of your supporting details, showing it clearly, and then your summary. So if you want people to read your reasons, then it needs to be readable and interesting, I would think. Yeah.
I'm reminded of Kim Stanley Robinson's book about his travels to Antarctica, and would recommend those as an illustration of what you're saying.
Right, that it's vivid and exciting and interesting, and yet it is nonfiction with lots and lots of information. You come away having learned a ton and also really enjoyed the adventure. I would say that's true of his High Sierra one too. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on character monologue? And it starts off with how you already delineated it just now, where the character monologue actually tells the story. It's in an essay, it's not in.
So there's a first-person story, which is kind of what a memoir is, right?
Yeah, this is fiction, and
but you have a main character that's being the narrator.
right.
You know, what is it, Sands Hall, in her book, whose name I'm not going to remember, talks about the 2 kinds of personal narrators. There's the narrator now, or the wise narrator, and there's the narrator then, the one who was in the moment, the young, innocent one in the middle of the action. And there are narrators in between. You know, memoir, we use that. We tell the story when we were 25, right? But then we interject, oh, but by the time I was 35, I figured that wasn't working, and now I know, blah, blah, blah. I think you can do that with a first-person fictional narrator, too, and maybe that will help in the sense that that person can both be speaking from in the moment, as well as reflecting from a distance and bringing insight, or it would make the person more three-dimensional. Am I answering what you thought?
So how do you place it? Is it in italics, or is it?
Oh. You know, there seems to be a real discussion about how you use italics. More and more people are using italics for inner thoughts. Too much italics, though, is really distracting. So I don't know the answer to that question. Maybe you offset it as opposed to italicizing it. You know, Poisonwood Bible, it's an old book, but it's always the one that comes to my mind. Barbara Kingsolver always comes to my mind, where she was one of the first books I ever read where there were, what, 3 or 4 separate narrators.
Yep.
And they each have a very distinctive voice, and you could tell them apart immediately. And people are doing that more and more. The book I'm reading right now, whose name I cannot remember, 1, 2, 3, by Lori Frankel, does the same thing, 3 sisters. And you hear their inner thoughts, and they tell the story, and yet it's very vivid, even though it's all narrated by these voices. So I don't know that I'm answering your question, but maybe those 2 examples might help.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all. It has been, oh, Linda.
Well,
Really?
I want to ask this, I guess, and that is, I noticed in my own little examples we did today, what a strong tendency I have to start with my own internal world. And if I'm going to describe something outside, first, my tendency, a strong tendency, is to go to what's happening inside me that is driving whatever I'm going to be engaged with. And I think it kind of gets in the way, but I don't know if you have ideas of how to, you know, how to...
My writing teacher, Pat Miller, always calls that clearing your throat. That you start, it's like you feel compelled to explain why you're going to tell us this. And you do this background thing. And it's not bad to get it down and out, but then delete it. And just jump right in. But somehow it's clarifying for ourselves as to why we're writing this and where we're coming from and where we're going and blah, blah, blah. But the reader, it could care less. You know, it's kind of that idea of I went and I opened the door and I walked in the room and I looked around. How about you just start with, oh, I looked up and there was my mother. I mean, why do you have to do this wandering intro, right? And I think that's what we do. So clearing your throat, get rid of it. Write it down and then get rid of it. And if there's something important in that paragraph, figure out how to stick it in the middle of the action.
Okay.
All right, well,
Thank you very
thank you all so much.